She thought it was just another family dinner, until her daughter refused a simple hug. At first, everyone laughed it off, calling her dramatic, shy, even spoiled. But Claire saw the fear in her little girl's eyes, the way her hands twisted at her dress, the locked doors at night, the drawings hidden under her bed. When the truth finally came out, Claire made one phone call that shattered the silence and changed everything. What secret was her daughter carrying? And why did the police walk straight into their dining room to take someone away? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The afternoon had the kind of stillness that only came with heat pressing down from every side. The grill smoked lazily in the corner of the yard, thin ribbons rising into a sky so bright it bleached the edges of the trees. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of aunts and cousins. Paper plates bent beneath potato salad and ribs. Someone had set a radio on the porch, the music tinny and fading in and out when the breeze shifted. Claire sat at the edge of the gathering with her daughter, watching as laughter traveled around the table in practice waves. Lila held her plastic cup with both hands, sipping slowly as though it gave her something to do. She was 9, small for her age, her dark hair tucked behind her ears in a way that made her look older than she was when she went still. Claire noticed the way her daughter's eyes flicked toward the gate, then down at her sandals, then back to her mother in quick glances that asked for something without using words. It was then that Daniel stepped out from the kitchen, sunglasses perched on his head, beer in hand. He was dressed like he always was for these gatherings. Pressed polo shirt, jeans with a belt that gleamed too much in the sun. His laugh arrived before he did, drawing a few heads toward him, and then he was moving to the yard with the casual authority of someone who assumed he belonged at the center of things. "Where's my favorite girl?" he said, spreading his arms wide as he approached Lila. Claire watched her daughter stiffen, watched her shoulders draw upward, small fingers tightening around the cup until thin plastic bowed inward. Daniel crouched slightly, opening his arms as though waiting for the ritual everyone expected. But instead of stepping forward, Lila stepped back, her heels scraping against the grass. She folded her arms behind her back as though anchoring herself, chin down, refusing without words. For a second, everything in the yard seemed to pause. The scrape of a fork against a paper plate, the shuffle of an ant reaching for napkins. Each small noise fell silent. A cousin looked away quickly, pretending to be absorbed in the coleslaw. Daniel held his pose for a beat too long, his smile fixed but brittle at the edges. "Shy today, huh?" he said finally, chuckling as if to smooth it over. "That's all right. Girls go through moods." He straightened, taking a sip of his beer, forcing the air back into motion. Laughter came again, thinner now, like something rehearsed. But Claire's gaze stayed on her daughter. She saw the color drain from Lila's cheeks, the way her lips pressed together until they thinned to a pale line. She saw her hands, still hidden behind her back, fingers twitching against each other in small, restless movements. It wasn't shyness. It was something else, something that made her daughter's small frame hold itself like glass that might shatter with the wrong touch. Claire reached out and brushed her hand against Lila's arm, a gesture casual enough to be overlooked. Lila leaned closer, almost imperceptibly, as though needing the contact. Daniel had already turned back to the grill, launching into a story that had the others nodding along. But Claire wasn't listening. Her focus stayed on her daughter's shallow breaths, the way her chest rose and fell too quickly for the slow rhythm of a summer afternoon. The yard went on around them, plates being cleared, drinks refilled, stories retold with laughter that sounded louder than it needed to. But the silence between Claire and her daughter carried more weight than all of it. Lila did not speak, yet her refusal had already spoken for her. And in that silence, Claire felt the first thread of unease tug loose, a thread that would not let itself be tied back again. Daniel straightened from his crouch with a laugh that carried too brightly across the yard, the kind of sound meant to fill space quickly before anyone could comment on what had just happened. "Guess I have to earn that hug," he said, shaking his head as though the refusal were nothing more than a child's passing whim. His smile was wide, his voice carrying over the crackle of the grill and the clink of ice in glasses. But it didn't settle right. It was too quick, too polished, like someone covering a stumble with a rehearsed line. The laughter that followed came scattered, uneven. An aunt chuckled as she stacked paper plates, her eyes already sliding away. A cousin let out a short snort that ended abruptly when no one joined in. The sound spread in pieces around the folding chairs, but none of it seemed to reach Claire. To her, it was thin and strained, the kind of laughter that tried to plaster over discomfort. Claire kept her gaze on Lila. Her daughter stood a step behind her chair now, half hidden, her small body angled away from the crowd. Her face had gone pale in the afternoon light, and the flush that should have risen from the heat of the sun was absent. Claire's eyes traveled to the hem of Lila's cotton dress, where her fingers worked restlessly, twisting the fabric tighter and tighter until the folds bunched. The motion was steady, almost desperate, as though she needed the pressure to keep something inside from spilling out. Daniel had already turned back toward the men by the grill, launching into a story about traffic on the highway, about the size of the steaks he had brought from his butcher. His voice rose easily, his gestures confident, and soon the rhythm of the gathering seemed to pick up again. Smoke lifted from the grill in dark coils. Someone set out another bowl of chips, and the radio crackled back into tune with an old summer song. Yet for Claire, the stillness remained. She nodded when her sister asked if she wanted more lemonade, but her thoughts stayed fixed on her daughter's silence. Every detail was too sharp. The whiteness of Lila's knuckles against the yellow fabric, the way her lower lip caught between her teeth, the faint tremor in her shoulders whenever Daniel's voice grew louder. Claire leaned down slightly, her hand brushing against Lila's back, a touch meant to soothe without drawing attention. The girl leaned closer for just a second, pressing into her mother's side before straightening again, as if afraid of being noticed. Claire forced herself to smile when her brother-in-law cracked another joke across the yard, but her jaw felt tight, her cheeks aching from effort. Conversations carried on. Someone shouted for more barbecue sauce. A plate slipped and hit the grass, sparking another round of uneasy laughter. But Claire could feel the undercurrent beneath it all, like a low hum that others had chosen not to hear. She caught Daniel glancing once in their direction, his eyes sliding over Lila with something she couldn't name before he looked back to the sizzling grill. He was still smiling, still talking, as though nothing had happened. Claire reached for her own glass. Her hand, steady though her stomach felt unmoored. The sweet, watered-down lemonade did nothing to cool the dryness in her throat. Around her, the family's voices rose again, louder than before, as though volume could erase the awkward silence that had fallen only moments earlier. But in the corner of her vision, her daughter's hands kept twisting the dress hem, tighter and tighter, until the cotton stretched under the strain. It was then that Claire knew the laughter had not closed anything. It had only sealed something shut inside her daughter, something that was waiting, pressing against the seams. And no amount of jokes or easy smiles would be able to keep it hidden for long. The drive home stretched longer than it should have, the narrow county roads twisting beneath the fading light of evening. The summer air still carried the faint sweetness of cut grass and charcoal smoke, lingering reminders of the family gathering they had just left behind. Claire kept her hand steady on the wheel, her gaze fixed on the empty stretch of road ahead, but her attention drifted often to the small figure in the back seat. Lila sat pressed against the door, cheek resting on the glass, eyes trained on the blur of trees and houses passing by. She hadn't said a word since they left, and the silence filled the car heavier than any conversation could have. Claire cleared her throat softly. "Did you have fun today?" Her voice was gentle, careful, as though speaking too loudly might shatter something fragile. Lila didn't move, didn't answer. The glass fogged faintly from her breath, and one finger traced an absent line down the window before falling still again. Claire tried again, her words slower this time. "I noticed you didn't want to hug Uncle Daniel. That's all right. You don't have to if you don't want to. But I just want to know was something wrong." For a moment she thought her daughter hadn't heard her. The only sound was a low hum of the engine, the tires rolling steadily over the road. Then Lila shifted slightly, tucking her knees up toward her chest as if making herself smaller. Her voice came so quiet it nearly vanished into the hum of the car. "I don't like him." The words were thin, almost weightless, but they landed heavy in Claire's chest. She glanced in the rearview mirror, catching only the outline of Lila's face in the dim light. Her eyes still turned away. "Okay, Claire said carefully, steadying her tone. That's important. You don't have to like everyone, but can you tell me why? There was no answer. Lila's shoulders lifted and fell in the smallest shrug. She turned her head slightly toward the window, her reflection faint in the glass, lips pressed together as if keeping something in place. Claire let the silence linger for a while, the car carrying them farther from the chattered relatives, deeper into the quiet of the drive. She wanted to press, to demand answers, but the stillness of her daughter's small body told her not to. She had learned that sometimes pushing too hard made children retreat further into themselves, and she couldn't afford to lose what little had just been said. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. Streetlights flickered on in the neighborhoods they passed, small squares of yellow light in windows marking families, settling into evening routines. Claire slowed at a stop sign and looked once more at her daughter through the mirror. Lila's fingers had found the edge of her shirt, twisting and untwisting the fabric just as she had with her dress earlier in the day. "I hear you," Claire said softly. "You don't like him. That's enough for now." Her daughter gave no response, but the tension in her small frame eased, just slightly, as though the permission not to explain had given her room to breathe. Claire pressed her foot on the gas again, the car rolling forward into the growing night. The road ahead felt unfamiliar, even though she had driven it countless times. Every curve and turn seemed different, sharper somehow, because of those four words echoing in her mind. "I don't like him." She gripped the wheel tighter, the steady hum of the tires sounding more like a warning than a comfort. Something had shifted, quietly, almost invisibly, but it had shifted all the same. And as the headlights carved the way home, Claire knew that silence would not be able to hold back the truth forever. The house settled into the kind of quiet that only arrived after long summer days, when the air still carried the faint warmth of the sun and the smell of charcoal seemed to linger in the walls. Claire moved through her nightly routine with deliberate slowness, rinsing plates, folding stray towels, checking that the back door was locked. Each task was meant to keep her mind busy, but her thoughts never drifted far from her daughter. Upstairs, the creak of floorboards told her that Lila had retreated early. She had gone straight from brushing her teeth to her room, without the usual chatter, without asking for an extra glass of water or a few more minutes before bed. Claire listened as her daughter's small steps moved across the carpeted hall, then the distinct click of the lock sliding into place on her bedroom door. The sound struck her like a sudden draft of cold air. Lila had never locked her door before. Claire stood at the bottom of the staircase for a long time, staring upward at the narrow strip of light beneath the closed door. She wanted to knock, to ask why, but the memory of the car ride returned, her daughter's voice whispering, "I don't like him." Pressing would only make her retreat further. So Claire turned away, letting the house grow quiet around her, though the click of that lock kept replaying in her mind. Hours later, when the house was deep in stillness and even the refrigerator hummed softly as though careful not to disturb the silence, Claire found herself climbing the stairs. She told herself it was just to check the windows, to be sure the summer night hadn't left them open, but her feet carried her toward Lila's door. The light was off inside, the thin line beneath the door completely dark now. She leaned close and listened. No sound, only the steady rhythm of a child's sleep. Claire turned the knob gently, testing, though she already knew, the lock held firm. She let it go and moved on, heart tight. In her own room, sleep would not come. She shifted between sheets that suddenly felt too heavy, the night air too close. Thoughts circled with no resolution. Finally, she rose again and returned to Lila's room, this time not to knock, not to wake her, but to enter quietly once morning arrived. By dawn, she eased the door open with a careful turn of the key she kept for emergencies. Lila was still curled in sleep, her face buried against the pillow, her small hands tucked beneath her chin. The room was dim, the curtains drawn against the rising sun. Claire moved quietly, eyes scanning as though searching for something she could not name. It was then, crouching to pick up a dropped sock near the bed frame, that she saw the edge of paper jutting from beneath the mattress. She reached down, sliding it free with slow fingers. The drawing was simple, done in thick crayon strokes. Colors pressed hard into the page the way children often do when emotion drives their hands. There were 3 figures, one small, one taller beside her, both with smiling faces. The third towered over them, a broad outline with arms that stretched too long, too close. And across that figure's face was a jagged black scribble, so heavy that the paper had torn with a crayon pressed again and again. Claire sat back on her heels, the drawing trembling in her hands. She traced a smaller figure, her daughter, without doubt, and the tall one beside her, a mother's outline sketched with familiar care. The dark figure loomed above, faceless now under the angry scrawl. She pressed the page flat against her lap, her throat tight. It was only a child's drawing, nothing more than lines on paper. But the silence in the house, the locked door, the twisting of fabric in her daughter's hands, all of it now folded into the dark scribble before her. Claire slid the drawing back where she had found it, careful not to wake Lila. She rose quietly, but her body felt unsteady, as if the floor itself had shifted. Downstairs, the early light filled the kitchen, bright and ordinary. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. The kettle hissed on the stove, its rising steam curling into the kitchen light. Claire stood beside it with her hand resting on the counter, not moving to switch it off, not even noticing the water beginning to boil over. Her mind had slipped away, drawn backward to the last few months, picking up pieces she had ignored at the time. Lila had once begged for sleepovers. Just last year, she'd filled her backpack with pajamas and stuffed animals and run down the sidewalk to her friend's house with the excitement of someone leaving for an adventure. But lately, each invitation had been met with silence, her shoulders hunching as she mumbled that she'd rather stay home. Claire had accepted it easily at first, telling herself children grew out of things. That phase has passed like seasons. She hadn't pressed. Now, the memory felt different, more deliberate, as though her daughter had been seeking safety she didn't want to explain. The kettle gave a sharp whistle, pulling Claire back just long enough to flick off the burner. She poured the water into a mug, watching the steam rise, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down on the table. She thought of the night she had stripped sheets quietly, carrying them to the laundry room so Lila wouldn't feel embarrassed. Bedwetting had returned without warning, long after Claire had thought they were past that stage. She had whispered reassurances, blamed the juice before bed, or the long school days. She had told herself it was nothing unusual, that children sometimes slip backward under stress. She hadn't wanted to connect it to anything else. She hadn't wanted to ask if there was something more behind the damp fabric. The way her daughter clung tighter afterward when Claire tucked her back into bed. Her mug sat untouched as she turned toward the refrigerator. Pinned there with a magnet was a photograph from the last holiday gathering. Everyone had crowded together, smiling in forced cheer. Claire studied the picture with new eyes. In the corner stood Lila, her smile faint, her eyes distant, her body angled slightly away from the group. Daniel's arm rested across the back of the chair beside her, his hand too close. Claire remembered how Lila had slipped away right after the picture was taken, claiming she needed to use the bathroom, not returning until the camera had been put away. Other moments returned with a sharpness that unsettled her. The time Lila had ducked out a family photo at the park, running toward the swings until they'd given up and taken the picture without her. The way she had stopped wanting to sit on anyone's lap, even relatives she had once adored. The way her laughter had become quieter, shorter, as though always interrupted by a thought she couldn't speak aloud. Claire sank into a chair, her hands pressing against her temples. Each memory had seemed small on its own, the kind of thing parents filed away under the endless list of quirks and changes that children cycled through. But laid out together, they felt heavier, like entries in a ledger she hadn't wanted to keep. Each line, each detail, carried a weight that pressed down until her breath caught in her throat. The kitchen was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Claire reached for the mug, but the tea had already cooled. She didn't drink it. Instead, she stared at the table's wooden grain, tracing the grooves with her eyes as if they might give her answers. But the only thing she could see, the only thing that grew clearer with each recollection, was the pattern. Her daughter had been trying to tell her all along, not with words but with refusals, with silences, with small acts of avoidance. And Claire, busy holding the family together, smoothing over gatherings and explaining away changes had chosen not to see. Now those details crowded her mind with clarity that left her no room to look away. The knock came just as Claire was setting plates on the table. She startled at the sound, her hand tightening around the rim of a dish until the porcelain tapped hard against the wood. Dinner was nothing special. Chicken roasted with lemon, green beans, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. The house smelled of comfort and routine, the kind of meal meant to steady a long day. But the knock shifted everything, like a sudden draft through a closed room. Lila was already at the table, crayons scattered beside her plate, where she had been sketching while waiting. At the sound, her hand froze midline. The crayon rolled from her fingers and clattered softly to the floor. She didn't move to pick it up. Her eyes darted toward the door, then back to her mother, wide and expectant, as though she already knew who it was. Claire wiped her palms on a dish towel and went to answer. When she opened the door, Daniel stood on the step, smiling as though his presence required no explanation. He carried nothing with him, not wine, not dessert, not even an excuse. Just himself, framed by the porch light, sunglasses hanging from the collar of his shirt, though evening was already pressing in. "Smells good in there," he said, leaning slightly as if to peer past her. "Thought I'd drop by, see my favorite girls." The words landed too easily, practiced in their warmth. Claire forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's a school night," she said, her tone even. "We were just sitting down." "Perfect timing, then," he replied, stepping forward before she had truly opened the way. His smile was wide, his voice carrying the kind of charm that sounded rehearsed. Claire let him pass, though unease prickled along her skin. She shut the door quietly and turned to see Lila had moved. The girl now stood behind her chair, small hands gripping the wooden slats so tightly her knuckles showed white. She pressed her body close to the chair's back, half hidden, as though it might shield her from view. Daniel spread his arms as if greeting old friends, but his eyes scanned the room quickly, landing on Lila with a too bright glimmer. "There she is," he said, his voice softening in a way that made Claire's stomach turn. "Hiding from me again?" No one laughed this time. Claire remained still, watching closely. Lila said nothing, her eyes fixed on the floor. The tension in her small shoulders was visible, her spine rigid, her breath shallow. She looked like a creature frozen in the hope that stillness might make her invisible. Claire moved to the table and touched her daughter's shoulder gently. The girl flinched at first, then leaned subtly into the contact, eyes never leaving the floor. Claire's gaze shifted back to Daniel, who was lowering himself into a chair uninvited, his smile unchanged but his eyes sharp with a flicker of something she could not ignore. The room was warm from the oven, but Claire felt cold. She noticed how Daniel's glance lingered on Lila longer than it should, how the smile stretched wider whenever the girl shifted. It was a smile of someone trying too hard to appear harmless, too warm, too easy. Claire sat across from him, her hand resting firmly on Lila's back. She kept her tone steady, polite, asking if he wanted bread, if he cared for beans. But every question was a shield, every word a measure of control, to keep the silence from cracking open. Lila remained behind her chair, refusing to sit, refusing to speak. And in that rigid stillness, Claire found her own resolve hardening. Daniel could laugh, he could smile, he could pretend at casual visits. But the truth was in her daughter's silence, in the way her body locked itself against him. And Claire, watching from across the table, knew she could no longer explain it away. The hallway smelled faintly of floor polish and pencil shavings, that peculiar blend every school seemed to carry. Claire walked slowly past the rows of lockers, their metal doors dented from years of use, and stopped at the door marked Room 14. Inside, children's drawings fluttered on the corkboard, bright suns, houses with crooked chimneys, stick figures holding hands. They were cheerful, but when Mrs. Halloway, Lila's teacher, motioned Claire inside, the warmth of the pictures did little to soften the weight in her chest. "Thank you for coming in," Mrs. Halloway began, folding her hands on the desk. She was a woman with kind eyes that had seen many children pass through her classroom, her voice steady but tinged with concern. "I wanted to talk about some changes I've noticed with Lila." Claire sat, clutching her bag in her lap. Her heart beat faster, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. Changes? Mrs. Holloway nodded. She's always been a bright, eager student. Raised her hand often, wanted to help, participated in everything. Lately, she paused, searching for the right words. She doesn't raise her hand anymore. She avoids group work. She keeps her eyes down when I call on her. Sometimes she looks afraid, not of me, but of being noticed. The words pressed against Claire like stones. She swallowed, afraid. Before the teacher could continue, the door opened and a counselor stepped in. Mrs. Jacobs, the school counselor, carried a folder tucked under her arm, her expression calm but purposeful. She took a seat beside the teacher and leaned forward slightly. "I've also been observing her during recess and lunch," she said. "She spends a lot of time alone. She'll sit at the edge of the playground, drawing in the dirt with a stick, rather than playing with the other children." Claire's throat felt tight. She pictured her daughter alone on the blacktop, the laughter of other children swirling around her while she traced lines on the ground. Mrs. Jacobs opened the folder and glanced at her notes. Sometimes when children change this way, it can be a sign of something deeper. Withdrawn behavior often points to stress, anxiety, even trauma. Her voice softened at the last word, careful, deliberate. The air seemed to leave the room. Trauma. The word carried too much weight, too many possibilities. Claire gripped the strap of her bag harder, trying to ground herself. She forced her voice steady. She hasn't said anything. At least, nothing clear. Just, she hesitated, remembering the car ride. The whisper, "I don't like him." Just small things. Mrs. Jacobs nodded. Children don't always have the words. They tell us in other ways, through behavior, through silence. Our job is to listen to what the changes are saying. Claire wanted to ask what exactly they thought was happening, but the words caught in her throat. To say them aloud would make them real, undeniable. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, she nodded, her lips pressed in. Mrs. Holloway leaned forward gently. "We're here to support her. Whatever is happening, Lila needs to know she's safe, both at school and at home. She needs reassurance." Claire nodded again, though her chest felt heavy with unshed words. She thanked them, stood, and left the office with her bag clutched tightly to her side. The hallway outside was filled with the distant sound of children laughing, doors slamming, sneakers squeaking against linoleum. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary day. But as Claire walked toward the exit, the word echoed again and again in her mind. Asterisk trauma. Asterisk. She stepped into the sunlight, blinking against its brightness, and felt the ground beneath her feet shift. The teachers had seen it too. It was no longer just in her imagination. Something was happening to her daughter, something she could no longer ignore. The house was quiet in the early evening, the kind of quiet that made every small sound louder. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed sharper, the hum of the refrigerator a steady backdrop against the silence. Claire moved through Lila's room with care, not to intrude but to tidy, the way mothers often do. The bed was unmade, crayons scattered across the comforter, a sweater draped over the chair in the corner. She bent to gather stray pencils from the floor and noticed a notebook lying half open beneath the desk. It was one of the standard school notebooks, spiral-bound, the cover decorated with doodles of flowers and shapes that only a child's hand could draw. Claire picked it up, intended to place it back on the desk, but the edge of a page caught her eye. The paper was jagged, as if it had been torn from the coil in haste. She hesitated before flipping through, her fingers careful not to bend the pages. Halfway in, she stopped, scrawled in thick, uneven letters, pressed so hard that the pencil nearly tore the page, were the words, "I don't want to go near him." The writing leaned downward, rushed, almost panicked, the graphite smudge where small hands must have brushed against it. Claire's breath caught. She read the sentence again, her eyes tracing each word slowly as though they might change if she looked long enough. "I don't want to go near him." The simplicity of the words was what struck her most. Not a description, not an explanation, just refusal, pure and unshaped. It was the kind of sentence that carried weight because of what it didn't say. Her eyes moved to the edge of the page, where the spiral's teeth still clung to scraps of torn paper. Something had been removed, ripped out forcefully, leaving only the trace of what had once been there. Claire ran her thumb over the rough edge, her mind filling with questions. What had been written before this? Or after? Who was him? The name wasn't written, but her chest tightened with the answer she didn't want to think. She sat down on the edge of the bed, notebook still open across her lap. The room was dim now, shadows lengthening against the walls, the last light of the day slipping to the curtains. Claire could smell the faint sweetness of crayons and the powdery scent of pencil shavings clinging to the paper. She imagined her daughter sitting at this very desk, small body hunched, pressing the pencil hard as she wrote words too heavy for her age. Her mind replayed the moment she had tried to explain away. The locked bedroom door, the bedwetting, the refusal at the family barbecue. Each memory now folded itself into the sentence before her, amplifying it until it was impossible to ignore. The torn page whispered of things hidden, secrets that her daughter had tried to put down and then erase. Claire closed the notebook gently, her hand resting on the cover as if to keep it safe. She sat in silence, listening to the sound of her daughter's faint humming from down the hall as she played with her dolls. The normalcy of that small sound felt unbearable against the weight of the words inside the notebook. Her heart pounded with the certainty that something had crossed from suspicion into truth. She had found the evidence, not of everything, but of enough. And even though the page was torn, even though so much remained unsaid, the sentence that remained was clear enough to pierce through all doubt. I don't want to go near him. Claire drew in a shaky breath and set the notebook carefully on her nightstand, as though it were fragile. The torn edge seemed to stare back at her, accusing and unfinished, but the words that remained were enough to make her hand tremble long after she had put it down. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee, and the lemon cleaner her sister always used on the counters, sharp and artificial. Afternoon light spilled to the blinds, striping the table where two mugs sat, one untouched and the other already half empty. Claire wrapped her fingers around her own cup, though she hadn't taken a sip. The warmth of the ceramic felt grounding. Something to hold on to while her thoughts threatened to spin loose. Across from her, Anna, her older sister by 2 years, Daniel's wife, was fussing with a napkin, folding and unfolding it as if it needed to be smoothed. Her expression was polite, even cheerful, as though she couldn't quite sense the weight hanging between them. Claire leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. "Anna, I need to ask you something about Daniel." Her sister looked up, startled, then chuckled lightly as if trying to soften whatever was coming. "What about him? He's at work. You just missed him." "It's not about where he is," Claire said. She hesitated, then pushed forward. "It's about Lila." That name landed in the air between them. Anna's brow furrowed, a small crease forming above her nose. "What about her?" Claire felt her throat tighten. The words she had rehearsed in her head didn't come out smoothly. She doesn't want to be near him. She pulls away. She hides when he comes around. She told me. Her voice dropped lower, steady but trembling at the edges. She told me she doesn't like him. For a moment, Anna said nothing. Then, with a short laugh that felt too loud in the quiet kitchen, she waved her hand. "Oh, Claire, she's just dramatic. You know, kids, they go through phases. One day they love you. The next they act like you're a stranger. It's nothing." Claire flinched at the dismissal. "Nothing?" The words scraped out harsher than she intended. She set her mug down too firmly, the sound echoing against the wooden table. She locks her bedroom door at night. She won't sit at the table when he visits. She stopped herself before mentioning the notebook, the drawings, the whispers. Even saying this much left her feeling exposed. Anna shook her head, still smiling, though it wavered now. "You always were a worrier. Lila's a sensitive child. If you keep feeding into it, she'll just get worse. You can't jump to wild conclusions every time she sulks." The words landed like stones. Claire stared at her sister, searching her face for any crack of doubt, any flicker of concern, but found only a thin patience, the kind used when indulging someone seen as fragile. "She's not sulking," Claire said softly. Her hands trembled against the table, so she laced them together to keep them still. "She's telling us something, Anna. Maybe not in words we want to hear, but she's telling us. Anna's expression hardened just slightly, a wall sliding into place. Claire, you're making something out of nothing. Don't drag my husband into your overthinking. Silence settled between them. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock. Every sound seemed to grow louder in the pause. Claire pushed her chair back, the legs scraping against the tile, and stood. Her sister forced another laugh, though it faltered this time. Come on, don't be so serious. You'll scare yourself silly. Lila's fine. She's a child. They're dramatic, that's all. Claire stared at her sister for a long moment, her jaw tight. She wanted to shout, to shake her, to force her to see what she refused to look at. But the words stuck, heavy in her chest. Instead, she turned toward the door. The dismissal burned, settling deep inside her like a coal that would not cool. As she stepped out of the kitchen, leaving the smell of lemon cleaner and coffee behind, she knew one thing with certainty. Her sister would not protect Lila. That responsibility fell to her alone. The house had quieted into its nighttime rhythm, each sound sharp against the stillness. The clock in the living room ticked steadily. The refrigerator hummed. And now and then a car passed on the street outside, headlights flashing briefly across the walls. Claire sat in her room with a book open on her lap, unread, her ears tuned more toward the faint creaks of the hallway than the words on the page. She had grown used to listening like this, half expecting to hear her daughter stir, half dreading what the night might bring. When the soft creak of Lila's door came, Claire set the book aside. She stepped quietly into the hall and saw her daughter standing there, small and fragile in the dim light, clutching the hem of her pajama top. Her eyes looked too large for her face, wide and uncertain. "Can I sleep with you?" Lila's voice was barely audible, almost carried away by the hum of the house. "Of course," Claire whispered, reaching out her hand. Lila's fingers slid into hers, cold despite the warmth of the room. Claire led her back to bed, tucking the sheets aside. But instead of curling against her pillow, Lila clung to her mother's side, pressing her face into Claire's shoulder. They lay in silence for several minutes, the light from the hallway spilling a narrow beam across the room. Claire stroked her daughter's hair, steady and slow, waiting. She could feel the tension in the small body press against her, the shallow rhythm of her breathing. Then, in a voice so faint Claire had to strain to hear it, Lila began to speak. "I don't like it when he comes near me." Her words trembled, each one sounding like it cost her something to release. "He tries to hug me, but it's not a hug. His hands, they don't stop where they should." Claire's heart stopped. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her hand froze in her daughter's hair, her whole body rigid as the words settled in. Lila went on, whispering against her shoulder. "He tells me it's just our secret, that I shouldn't tell anyone. But I don't want him near me. I don't want him here." Her voice cracked, a small sob slipping through before she quickly pressed her face harder into her mother, as if trying to hide inside her. Claire's chest ached. She wanted to scream, to tear through walls, to undo every moment her daughter had endured. But she knew she couldn't let that out now. She forced her voice to stay calm, to sound steady. "You did the right thing telling me," she whispered. "You don't have to keep it secret anymore. You're safe with me." Lila clung tighter, her small body trembling. Claire wrapped her arms fully around her, holding her close as though she could shield her from everything with just the strength of her embrace. They stayed that way until the shaking slowed, until the whispers faded into tired breaths and finally into sleep. But Claire did not close her eyes. She stared at the ceiling, the dim light casting shadows across the plaster, her mind racing. Each detail repeated itself in her head, sharp and unbearable, a truth she could no longer push aside. She held her daughter tighter, the weight of responsibility pressing heavy into her chest. Sleep would not come. Not tonight. Not until she knew what to do. The glow of the computer screen was the only light in the room, casting long shadows across the walls. Claire sat hunched over the desk, her hand gripping the mouse too tightly, the cursor hovering over words she almost couldn't bear to read. The rest of the house was silent, her daughter finally asleep after a restless evening, but Claire's own mind refused to quiet. She had laid beside Lila until her breathing evened out, waited until the weight of sleep softened her face, then slipped carefully from the bed and walked straight to the desk. Now, with the door shut and the house wrapped in silence, she began searching. Her fingers trembled as she typed into the search bar, "signs of abuse in children." The words felt foreign, monstrous even, as if putting them into writing might make them more real. But the results loaded instantly. Rows of articles, checklists from child advocacy centers, parenting forums filled with desperate voices. She clicked one, then another, her eyes scanning each line. Bedwetting after years of dryness. She thought of damp sheets clutched in her arms, of how she'd whispered reassurances to her daughter, while ignoring the gnawing question in the back of her mind. Sudden withdrawal from friends or activities once loved. The canceled sleepovers, the lonely corners at birthday parties, the refusal to join family photos, fear of specific people. Claire's stomach twisted. She didn't need the list to tell her who that was for Lila. Nightmares, anxiety, locking doors. She could still hear the sharp click of the lock in the hallway, the way it had startled her into stillness. Difficulty concentrating, sudden changes in school performance. The teacher's words returned to her now, withdrawn, eyes down, avoiding being called on. Each bullet point on the list felt like a stone dropping into her stomach. She opened another article, then another. The words blurred, but the meaning remained the same. Everything she had noticed, everything she had tried to explain away as phases or quirks, lined up perfectly with the symptoms staring back at her from the screen. Her hand moved to her mouth, pressing against her lips as if to hold back the sob building in her chest. She leaned closer to the screen, scrolling further. The article spoke of secrecy, of children blaming themselves, of perpetrators who used silence as their shield. Claire's chest tightened with rage and sorrow as she imagined her daughter carrying that weight alone. Convinced she couldn't speak, she pushed back from the desk, the chair's legs scraping loudly against the floor in the otherwise silent room. She pressed her palms into her eyes, but the images wouldn't fade. Her daughter's pale face, her twisting fingers, the scrawled words in her notebook. Asterisk, I don't want to go near him. Asterisk. The clarity she had sought now sat before her, undeniable. But it came with dread, so sharp it felt like a knife at her ribs. To accept what she now knew meant stepping into a storm she could never turn back from. It meant confrontation, police courtrooms. It meant her family torn down the middle. It meant putting Lila's words above the laughter and dismissal of others. Claire rose and paced the room, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. She glanced at the closed door of her daughter's bedroom down the hall, where soft breaths continued in fragile rhythm. The knowledge she now carried pressed heavy on her shoulders, almost unbearable. But beneath the dread, beneath the fear, there was something else, a growing resolve. The list hadn't only confirmed her worst fears. They had shown her that Lila wasn't imagining things, wasn't being dramatic or difficult. She was showing her mother the truth in every way she could. And now, Claire could no longer look away. She returned to the desk, closing the laptop with trembling hands. The room fell into darkness, but the clarity remained. She stood for a long time in that silence, her heart pounding, knowing that every step from here would matter. The yard was dressed for another Sunday gathering, the kind their family seemed to fall into by habit. Folding chairs circled the lawn, the grill smoked lazily, and the hum of conversation drifted across the grass. Children ran between adults, their laughter high and bright, but Claire's eyes stayed on her daughter. Lila sat at the edge of the group with a book in her lap, though she wasn't turning the pages. She held herself small, shoulders drawn in, feet tucked beneath her chair as though trying to fold away from sight. The gate creaked open, and Daniel's voice carried him before his face appeared. "Hope I'm not late," he called, a smile already fixed, his tone too easy. He strode into the yard with a practice wave, slipping into the circle of chairs as though he had been expected. The smell of cologne followed him, sharp beneath the scent of barbecue smoke. Claire felt her daughter stiffen even before she looked at him. Lila's hands closed the book quickly, pressing it flat against her knees. She slid her chair back an inch, then another, as Daniel came closer. Her body moved without words, but the message was plain: distance, distance, distance. Daniel bent to greet one of the nephews with a playful ruffle of his hair, laughter spilling from his mouth as if nothing could be more natural. But Claire watched the way his eyes flickered past the boy, landing on Lila for a moment too long. The smile didn't falter, but something behind it tightened, a small gleam in his gaze that made Claire's stomach twist. He drifted nearer, casual in his movements, telling a story about traffic on the way over, about the weather. But as he reached the space where Lila sat, his steps slowed. He leaned slightly toward her, one hand resting on the back of a chair that wasn't his. "There's my girl," he said, the words warm on the surface but heavy underneath. Lila pressed back into her chair, her small body rigid. She didn't answer, didn't even look up. Her fingers dug into the cover of her book, white at the knuckles. Claire caught the flicker of her daughter's eyes, a brief plea that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. Conversation around them carried on, an uncle asking for more iced tea, an aunt laughing too loudly at a half-finished joke. But Claire no longer heard it. The sounds blurred as she focused on the scene in front of her, her daughter shrinking, Daniel hovering, the space between them charged and suffocating. Claire moved closer, her hand resting on the back of Lila's chair, anchoring herself to her daughter's side. "She's reading," Claire said evenly, her voice a shield. "Give her space." Daniel straightened at once, laughing as if it were nothing. Of course. Didn't mean to interrupt. He turned away smoothly, folding himself back into group with practiced ease. But Claire noticed a quick glance he cast back, the way his smile never reached his eyes. The afternoon stretched on with its usual rituals. Plates passed, drinks poured, conversations looping in circles. But Claire's focus stayed sharp. Every time Daniel shifted closer, every time Lila pulled back, the pattern revealed itself more clearly. It was no longer a handful of isolated moments. It was repetition. It was deliberate. By the time the gathering wound down and chairs scraped against the grass, Claire felt a certainty settling into her chest like a stone. The pattern was undeniable now. Her daughter's fear was not imagined, not dramatic, not a phase. It was truth written in every movement of her body. And Claire knew, as she guided Lila out of the yard and toward the car, that silence was no longer an option. The bathroom was the only place in the house that felt sealed off, the only door Claire could lock without questions. She leaned against the sink, the cool porcelain pressing into her palms as she stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her face looked pale under the dim light, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind a dozen times, whispered half-formed sentences to herself when the house was quiet. But now that it was here, her throat felt dry and her chest tight. Behind a closed door, the rest of the house sat in silence. Lila had finally fallen asleep, her small body curled beneath the quilt, her breath steady but shallow, as though even in rest she wasn't fully at ease. Claire had waited until the rhythm of her daughter's sleep was certain, then slipped into the bathroom, shutting the door slowly, twisting the lock until it clicked. That sound felt final, a boundary between hesitation and action. She pulled her phone from her pocket, the screen lighting up her face in the dimness. Her thumb hovered over the keypad. Each number weighted heavier than it should have been. 911. She tapped slowly, carefully, as if the wrong press might undo her resolve. When the line rang, her heart pounded so loudly she almost didn't hear the operator's voice. "Emergency services. What's your emergency?" Her mouth opened, but no sound came at first. She closed her eyes, forcing air into her lungs. I need to report something," she said, her voice breaking on the first words. She gripped the sink harder, grounding herself. "It's about my daughter." The operator's tone softened, steady and precise. "All right, ma'am. Take your time. What's happening with your daughter?" Claire swallowed hard. "She's 9 years old. She's been showing signs of abuse." The word felt jagged, leaving her mouth, sharp and undeniable. She pressed her hand to her chest, as if she could steady her heart by force. "It's her uncle, my sister's husband. She told me things. She's scared of him." The silence on the other end lasted only a second, but it stretched for Claire, long enough to make her feel as if the world had stilled. Then the operator's voice came again, calm but firm. "You did the right thing by calling. We're going to help you. Can you tell me your address?" Claire recited it, her voice trembling at first, then steadier as she spoke each number, each word. The act of giving details, of making it specific, anchored her. She explained the drawings, the notebook, the whispered confession in the night. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. Each sentence was a release, as if she were pulling stones from her chest one by one. The operator reassured her, explaining that an officer would be sent, that she and her daughter would not face this alone. Claire listened, nodding even though the woman couldn't see her, tears streaking down her face silently. When the call ended, she lowered the phone slowly, staring at the dark screen. Her reflection in the mirror looked different now. Still pale, still weary, but with resolve that hadn't been there before. She unlocked the door quietly, slipping back into the hall, listening for the steady sound of her daughter's breathing. For the first time in weeks, she felt the faintest sense of direction. The dread hadn't vanished, but it had shifted into something sharper, something with purpose. She had spoken the truth aloud, and now it could not be taken back. The evening had settled into its familiar rhythm. Plates scraped softly against the table, glasses clinked, and Daniel's laughter rang too loudly in the dining room, filling the spaces where others' voices had fallen quiet. Claire sat at the far end of the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, nodding at conversations without hearing them. Lila lingered close to her, nibbling at bread but never looking up. Claire kept her eyes steady on her daughter, but her ears strained for another sound, the one she knew was coming. It began as a faint hum from the street outside, the low growl of engines moving at a deliberate pace. Daniel was in the middle of a story, one he had told before, about some deal at work, his words flowing in practiced rhythm. The sound of the engines drew nearer, tires rolling slowly over asphalt, lights flashing faintly through the curtains. Claire's pulse quickened. She reached beneath the table and touched Lila's hand. The girl startled, then leaned closer, small fingers curling tightly around her mother's. The hum stopped. Doors opened, shutting quietly, not with the slam of urgency but with the steadiness of control. Through the thin walls, Claire heard the low crackle of radio, a clipped voice confirming arrival. The air inside the house shifted. Conversations faltered. The laughter that had once seemed endless stuttered into silence. Daniel glanced toward the window, his smile still fixed, though his eyes sharpened. "What's that?" he asked lightly, as though the sound were nothing more than a passing car. Before anyone could answer, the knock came. Firm, measured, not rushed but not tentative either. The sound reverberated through the dining room, louder than it should have been. Chairs creaked as relatives exchanged uncertain looks. Claire rose slowly, Lila's hand still locked in hers, and crossed the door. She opened it to the sight of two uniformed officers standing side by side, their expressions solemn, their presence filling the doorway. Behind them, the faint glow of patrol car lights painted red and blue streaks across the pavement, reflections bouncing off the windows of curious neighbors peeking through curtains. "Ma'am," the taller officer said, his voice even but direct. "We need to come in." Claire stepped aside, her grip tightening on Lila's hand. The officers entered, their boots quiet on the floor, their presence commanding without a word. The room stilled entirely. Daniel's laughter, which had been so loud just minutes earlier, died on his lips. He sat frozen in his chair, his hand midway to his glass, the smile drained from his face. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice forced into a chuckle that didn't land. "Some mistake." The officers didn't answer immediately. One scanned the room, the other focused directly on him. Their calmness was louder than any accusation could have been. Relatives shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting from Daniel to men in uniform, the tension thick enough to choke on. Claire guided Lila behind her, her body instinctively forming a barrier. Her daughter pressed close, silent but steady, her small breaths quick against her mother's side. The officer nearest to Daniel spoke at last. "Sir, we need you to stand up." Daniel laughed again, but it cracked this time, a brittle sound. "Stand up? What for? I haven't done anything." But the room already knew. They could feel it in the silence, in the way Claire stood firm, in the way Lila clung to her mother's hand. The truth, long avoided, had arrived with the quiet authority of flashing lights and steady voices. And for the first time in too long, Claire felt that she and her daughter were no longer carrying it alone. The air in the dining room seemed to collapse when the officers moved toward Daniel. Chairs scraped back as relatives shifted aside, their faces pale and uncertain, no one daring to speak above a whisper. The clink of silverware and the smell of roasted chicken still hung in the air, remnants of a meal that no longer mattered. The only sound now was the firm, practiced voices of the officers as they asked Daniel once more to stand. He did, slowly, his movement stiff, his smile long gone. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. His hands hovered in the air before one of the officers took hold of his arm. The other began speaking rights in a steady monotone, the words echoing off the walls, foreign against a backdrop of family photos and holiday decorations. Claire stood motionless, her arm wrapped tightly around Lila, who pressed her face into her mother's side. She could feel the trembling in her daughter's small frame, each shudder rising through her body and into Claire's own chest. She bent her head low, murmuring nothing more than soft sounds of comfort, the same way she had soothed her daughter as a baby. Daniel looked back once as they guided him toward the door, his eyes sharp, searching, but no words came. He was ushered outside, and the heavy front door swung shut behind it with a sound that left the whole house vibrating. Beyond it, faint voices carried to the street, the distant crackle of radios, the low rumble of a patrol car engine idling. Inside, silence stretched. Relatives remained frozen around the table, some staring at their plates, others at Claire, none willing to break the stillness. Anna, Daniel's wife, stood rigid near the kitchen doorway, her lips pressed tight, her eyes darting between her sister and the door as if waiting for someone to undo what had just happened. But nothing could be undone. Claire lowered herself into a chair, pulling Lila onto her lap despite her age, holding her close as though she were still small enough to be cradled. The girl's hair brushed against her chin, her breasts uneven, but slowly, with the steady rhythm of her mother's arms wrapped around her, they began to calm. The silence lingered, heavy but no longer suffocating. It was broken only by the faint sounds outside, the opening of a car door, the muffled words of an officer, the engine shifting into gear. The patrol cars began to move, their low hum fading down the street until the house settled into stillness again. Claire smoothed her hand over her daughter's back, her own heart still racing, but steadier now than it had been in weeks. The fear was still there, the weight of what came next still heavy, but she knew the hardest step had already been taken. She had chosen to believe her child. Lila shifted, lifting her head just enough for her voice to reach her mother's ear. It was barely more than a whisper, fragile and trembling, but clear. "Thank you, Mom." The words broke something inside Claire, not in pain, but in release. She pressed her cheek against her daughter's hair, her eyes burning with tears. She didn't try to stop. She whispered back, "Always," her voice low and certain. Around them, the house remained quiet, the relatives still frozen in their own discomfort, but Claire no longer cared. The only sound that mattered was her daughter's voice, and the only weight that mattered was the small body she held close, finally safe in her arms.